In this lecture, we take a look at the astonishing 20th and early 21st centuries, an eye blink on the scale of big history that nonetheless utterly transformed the human world in ways both positive and negative. But we need to consider more than just the human world, because as our species used more and more resources, human impacts on the biosphere increased and threatened the very survival of so many other species, bringing into question the very meaning of economic growth. By the year 1900, the world had been split in two. One part had reaped the benefits of a massive increase in resources made available by the Industrial Revolution. The other had experienced decline of its wealth and autonomy. Yet the situation was more complicated because within each region, extremes of wealth and poverty also existed. In Britain, conditions in the major industrial cities in the 19th century had been so appalling that they helped fuel socialist ideologies. The socialists were determined to close the huge gap between capitalists and the working class, perhaps by Marxist revolution. Capitalism proved more robust and creative than Marx and Engels had prophesied, however, and governments experimented with new ways of managing modern states and the tensions within them. Throughout the long era of agrarian civilizations, tribute-taking states had ruled through the use of force rather than the market. And it took modern states time to work out new methods of political and economic management. Modern governments had to take on an entirely new role as economic managers because now the key to political and military power was sustained economic growth. This required a balancing act in administration between necessary government intervention to maintain infrastructure and law and order, but also non-intervention to help the market drive the capitalist economies. The experiments in government that took place during the 20th century were the first real innovations in how to administer a state since the great empires of the era of agrarian civilizations had appeared. Some modern governments limited their interference and let the markets drive growth, but others used more coercive techniques to manage society. Another challenge facing governments was the need to encourage participation and support of their policies from their citizens, which many sought through democracy, nationalism, and the provision of services. Most governments in the developed nations of the world granted voting rights to men and eventually to women. Nationalism was encouraged through education and the production of national histories that encouraged citizens to think of the nation as an extended family for whose sake they would be willing to sacrifice their own self-interest and even their lives. None of this stifled imperialist attitudes during the first half of the 20th century. The ancient habit of using military force for economic advantage was still alive and well and still justified by social Darwinism. But brutal force was not just used to control less powerful parts of the world for commercial advantage, it was also used in bitter confrontations between the most powerful societies. In seeking to protect their access to raw resources and markets, modern states did not hesitate to use war to pursue their interests. This came to a head in the summer of 1914 when war broke out between the leading European nations. Because of the industrialization of weapons, this First World War was particularly bloody, characterized by machine guns, powerful artillery, and poison gas. It resulted in the destruction of millions of soldiers from both the home countries and their colonies on battlefields all over the world, the greatest loss of life in war ever seen in human history until that time. The First World War generated such bitterness that the divisions that had caused it persisted after it was concluded, particularly after the victorious powers imposed harsh and expensive peace terms on Germany and Austria. The anger this generated led to the appearance of fascist parties. They used social Darwinian ideologies to portray international relations as a merciless battle between races and nations. In Russia, the world's largest country, the strains of World War I led to the collapse of the traditional Tsarist government and a seizure of power by the Socialist Bolshevik Party. Late in the 1920s, the global economic system came under tremendous strain as economies crashed in 1929 in the USA and Europe. This led to a global depression that lasted well into the 1930s. The Bolsheviks in Russia believed the system was doomed and attempted to build an alternative socialist society. Determined to industrialize rapidly, the leaders of the new Soviet Union, or USSR, drove the country's peasants into large collective farms. They established tough industrial discipline, and during the Stalinist era, they imprisoned or killed millions of dissenters. Imperial European powers also had no qualms in using violence to quell anti-colonial movements that broke out in their colonies in Asia and Africa. And Japan did much the same, using violence to turn Manchuria and Korea into colonies, and then turning on China with a brutal invasion in 1937. In pursuit of valuable resources such as oil and rubber, Japanese expansion continued until by 1942, most of the former European colonies in the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia had been incorporated into the Japanese Empire. A second brutal war erupted in Europe in 1939 and became globalized after Nazi Germany's army invaded Russia and the Japanese bombed a US naval base in Hawaii. The climax of the Second World War was the use for the first time of a devastating new weapon, an atomic bomb, by the United States on 2 Japanese cities. The war was staggeringly costly in terms of its destruction of infrastructure and human life. The Soviet Union alone lost about 10 million soldiers and up to 20 million civilians. At the war's end, however, it controlled much of Eastern Europe, including half of Germany. Civil war erupted in China, the most populous country in the world, shortly after the Second World War ended. In 1949, the country's Communist Party took over. By 1950, the world was thoroughly divided into a capitalist bloc led by the United States and its allies, a communist bloc led by the Soviet Union and China, and a large number of non-aligned countries, many of them former colonies, that tried to maneuver between the two blocs. Governments in the capitalist and communist blocs had entirely different visions of how to move forward from the Second World War. Both understood that economic growth was the key to success in the modern world, but where the Soviets believed their system of centralized control of the economy would best facilitate this, so the United States refocused on the power of markets and international trade to generate growth. The United States ended the war with its economic, political, and military power greatly enhanced, having endured none of the domestic destruction or civilian loss of life suffered by most of the other combatants. By 1950, its economy accounted for over 1/4 of global GDP. The US government believed that reigniting international trade and rebuilding the economies of other countries, including its former enemies, was the best way of sustaining growth for itself and the world as a whole. Before the war had even ended, a World Bank and an International Monetary Fund had been created to help establish a more stable capitalist financial order. And a new world organization, the United Nations, was created in 1945. The government of President Truman advanced the Marshall Plan, donating billions of dollars to rebuild the war-ruined economies of Europe and Japan, gambling on the idea that growth might benefit everyone. By the late 1950s, the gamble had paid off. The economies of Western Europe and Japan were booming, and the production of consumer goods created the sort of mass market that had already emerged in the United States. World trade took off more vigorously than ever before, and other East Asian nations followed the Japanese model. By 1989, the total share of global production coming from East Asia had risen to 25%. New economies were also established in the Muslim world, in Africa and South America, which held the promise of rapid economic growth, although in some, growth was sabotaged by the flow of profits into the hands of corrupt rulers or to pay massive international debts. As these commercial links expanded, it became increasingly difficult for European nations to justify colonialism, particularly as all the major imperialist powers had been weakened by war. So in the decades following the war, all remaining colonial powers gave up their empires and conceded independence to their former colonies, sometimes peacefully, other times after long and bloody wars. But because the colonial powers had done little to develop the economies, leadership, or education infrastructure of their colonies, the newly independent nations faced severe challenges and found themselves torn between following the capitalist or the socialist path. The Soviet Union was only too happy to lend economic, technical, and military support to allies in the former colonial world, from Cuba to Nigeria to Egypt, and the results served to demonstrate that communism did indeed provide a viable alternative path to modernity. The USSR rapidly caught up with the West in the decade following the Second World War. It boasted a superb modern educational system, a strong industrial sector, and nuclear weapons. In 1957, it sent the first satellite into space, and on April the 12th, 1961, it sent astronaut Yuri Gagarin into orbit around the Earth, the first time a human had ever entered outer space. Industrial growth was also rapid in China and parts of Eastern Europe, and for a while it seemed possible that the communist system would raise the living standards of its citizens more rapidly and overtake the capitalist system. But during the 1970s, the communist system began to struggle as it became obvious that its coercive methods of rule were not as capable of generating genuine innovation as free market economies. As Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev realized in the 1980s, the one justification for the brutal and authoritarian ruling methods of the Soviet Union's Communist Party, that it generated growth that would eventually benefit its citizens, had lost plausibility. Living standards were falling, and the Soviet Union was falling behind technologically. This reminds us, of course, that the centralized tribute-taking political systems that operated during the long era of agrarian civilizations were never good at encouraging innovation. The command economies of the communist world faced a similar problem because they suppressed the entrepreneurial markets that were the primary drivers of technological creativity in the capitalist world. Understanding this, Gorbachev attempted to reduce the role of the government in economic and political activity. The result, however, was that the Soviet economy and the very state itself came crashing down, and the communist experiment simply fizzled out in Europe. China navigated its way through economic challenges more successfully. The accession to power of Premier Deng Xiaoping led quickly to a transition to a market-driven economy, resulting in rapid economic growth while enabling China's Communist Party to retain political power. And so, regardless of their political ideologies and superstructures, governments around the world at the end of the 20th century demonstrated by their choices that capitalism provided the only viable means of maintaining prosperous societies over the long term. The sustained levels of growth achieved during the 20th century were staggering. Human populations quadrupled from roughly 1.6 billion in 1900 to 6.1 billion in the year 2000, an increase supported by the generation of enormous new resources. Before the 20th century, it had taken 200,000 years of human history to reach a population of 1 billion. Yet during the 20th century, we added over 5 billion more. And it was not just that there were so many more humans on the planet by the end of the 20th century. People were living much longer. Average life expectancies more than doubled from about 31 years to 66 years. Today, people in the developed world can expect to live well into their 70s on average. In sub-Saharan Africa, though, the figure seems stuck in the high 40s. Increased human numbers and lifespans were also greatly facilitated by medical innovations in the 20th century, particularly the discovery of vaccines and antibiotics. But nature keeps fighting back, evolving new forms of epidemic diseases and new bacteria almost as fast as we invent vaccines and antibiotics to fight them. Thomas Malthus would have been astonished at the degree to which food production outpaced population growth in the 20th century. Some statistics on this: well, the number of humans increased fourfold, total grain production increased fivefold, and the productivity of each acre of land increased threefold. Increasing agricultural productivity was achieved by the application of industrial and scientific technologies to farming. Fossil fuel-driven machines reaped and harvested. Irrigation, which had made the very first agrarian civilizations possible, became stupendous in size and scale, made possible by building huge dams and using complex canals to divert entire river systems. Chemical fertilizers dramatically improved the productivity of the land, and the fishing industry also intensified catches and greater use of technology. Science even learned to artificially manipulate the genes of domesticated crops and animals, moving genetic material from one species to another to engineer crops and animals that required little or no artificial fertilizer or that had natural protection against pests. Despite strong resistance to genetic modification, the technology was embraced in the United States, where by the early 21st century, something like 15% of corn, 30% of soybeans, and over 50% of cotton were genetically modified. Even as we live longer, we are also consuming more resources than at any other time in history. During the era of agrarian civilizations, most people were subsistence farmers. Only perhaps an elite 5% of the population was able to consume luxury goods. In the 20th century, humans consumed about double the resources that a person used just 2 generations earlier. This was a further indication of the power of collective learning and innovation, which now spawned entirely new products, from plastics to the laser beam to the internet. And because the competitive capitalist system forced greater efficiencies, these innovations became cheaper and more widely available. In the developed world today, billions of people live comfortable lives based on the consumption of luxury goods and enjoy a standard of living that has far surpassed that of ancient aristocrats. Today, we live in our modern castles, purchased by the availability of cheap credit, using electricity to power our mass-produced household machines. We use cheap oil to drive our private mass-produced cars along a vast global network of roads. These roads are themselves products of a revolution in transportation that also occurred during the 20th century. Automobiles, trucks, and buses make it easier than ever before to move people and goods over short and medium distances. And aeroplanes move millions of us every day over longer distances, while astonishingly large ships move goods across the oceans in massive quantities for sale and consumption. Even more spectacular is the revolution in the rapid movement of information, which has given an incredible boost to human collective learning. It wasn't that long ago that Mongol couriers on horseback or the Pony Express were the fastest technologies we had for communication. Then in 1837, Samuel Morse created the telegraph, and less than 40 years later, Alexander Graham Bell patented the first telephone. In 1899, Guglielmo Marconi used electric waves to send messages through the air, sending a radio message across the British Channel and 2 years later across the Atlantic. After the Second World War, humans had even figured out how to move pictures around the world through television. But it was the computer revolution of the late 20th century that has taken collective learning to an entirely new level again. Computer technology was pioneered during World War II, but like cars, computers only began to have a revolutionary impact when they became cheap enough for mass consumers. The joining of computers together in networks and the phenomenal increase in computers' processing speeds has magnified their power exponentially, meaning that collective learning can now function on a scale and with an efficiency utterly inconceivable just a very short while ago. In spite of their many horrors, the wars of the 20th century also produced, for good or ill, some remarkable innovations, including penicillin, radar, synthetic rubber, and the jet engine. Perhaps the most striking innovation was the increase in the power of our explosive devices, particularly after scientists unlocked the awesome power buried in atoms. The first practical fission weapon was exploded in New Mexico in July 1945. J. Robert Oppenheimer, director of the Manhattan Project, used a line from the Hindu Bhagavad Gita to try and capture the meaning of this terrifying new weapon. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. 3 weeks after it was first tested, an atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, killing 80,000 people almost immediately. Within a year, radiation and other injuries raised the total to almost 150,000. A second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki 3 days after the first was unleashed, with similar results. These terrifying military innovations, coupled with an increasing willingness to bomb civilian populations in what had become total war, explain why more than 50 million people were probably killed in the Second World War alone. As tensions between the US and the Soviet Union increased after the war, each began to stockpile nuclear weapons in a dangerous standoff that came to be known as the Cold War. By the time the Cold War peaked in the 1980s, the United States and the Soviet Union had the potential to unleash 70,000 nuclear warheads, with total explosive power equal to about 3.7 tons of TNT for every human on the planet. Humans had now acquired enough destructive power to do to themselves and the biosphere what an asteroid impact had done to the dinosaurs 65 million years earlier. Many began to question whether or not human creativity and achievement necessarily led to progress for civilization. The 20th century's innovations in food production, transport, communication, and warfare were coupled with a huge increase in human control of energy. It evolved from coal-fired steam power to the oil-driven industrial combustion engine, which literally drove many of the century's gains. But late in the 20th century, it became apparent that it might be dangerous and short-sighted to rely exclusively on fossil fuels, and so efforts were made to find alternatives, including the use of the energy within atoms for peaceful purposes. The first civilian nuclear power station began operation in the Soviet Union in 1954, and 50 years later, some 400 nuclear reactors were generating almost 80% of all the electricity used in France and 40% in South Korea and Japan. Nuclear power might be playing an even greater role had it not been for a series of dangerous accidents, such as the 1986 explosion of a reactor at Chernobyl in Ukraine. Other ways of generating energy, such as solar power and wind power, have also been developed, but none has been able to compete with our ongoing massive dependence on fossil fuels. All of these developments in energy and other fields have been products of a tremendous partnership between science, governments, business, and educational institutions. For most of history, innovation was the work of individuals or small groups. Even the inventions of the Industrial Revolution were the work of enthusiastic individuals like Watt and Stephenson. But in the 19th century, science and technology began to work together as governments and large businesses began to see science as the key to innovation and thus to sustain growth. These partnerships intensified in the 20th century as governments in particular supported research into improved weapons and explosives. But the spin-offs from this, like radar, computers, electronics, and satellite technology, had profound impacts on people's lives. It appears that perhaps 90% of all the scientists who have ever lived live in the early 21st century. Not all of the changes in human lifeways that originally looked like progress in the 20th century were beneficial. As just one example, subsistence farming largely disappeared as industrial agriculture took over the business of providing food, and unwanted peasant farmers were forced into squalid conditions in cities. Yet eventually most cities became wealthier and material standards of living rose as infrastructure improved and job opportunities multiplied. This increase in general wealth was driven by a new form of capitalism, consumer capitalism, whereby goods that had once seemed luxuries were now able to be produced cheaply enough for ordinary workers to purchase them. And as working class living standards improved, so the market for consumer goods expanded, supported by new retail outlets, by advertising, and by easier access to credit. Consumer capitalism also required an ethical revolution. Instead of encouraging restraint and thrift, the virtues of pre-modern societies, it celebrated consumption and extravagance, not just by elites who had always practiced conspicuous consumption to advertise their status, but within the population as a whole. Consumer capitalism also transformed the basic social unit of all human societies, the family. During the agrarian era, it made sense for parents to produce as many children as possible because children were an economically valuable resource who could be put to work on the farm. Because rates of infant mortality were high in all peasant societies, this meant that women had to keep producing children for as long as possible. As a result, women spent most of their lives bearing and rearing children. As rates of infant mortality declined as a result of better sanitation and better health care, people began to have fewer children. In the industrial age, having too many mouths to feed was an economic liability. New forms of birth control also lowered fertility rates. Rubber condoms appeared in the 1830s, and the contraceptive pill became available in the 1960s. By 2000, over 30 countries had zero population growth. Freed from the task of producing as many children for as long as possible, women found opportunities to play new roles in society as wage earners and in professional positions previously dominated by men. Women also finally gained voting rights in democracies after a long struggle. First in New Zealand in 1893, then Australia in 1902, followed by Finland, Russia, Great Britain, and finally Germany and the United States in 1919. This meant that the sharp gender divisions that had dominated the previous 10,000 years of human history finally began to break down in the industrialized world, even though women's wage rates still remain below those for men. What an ambiguous situation the 20th century presents for historians. Despite the negatives of economic depression, brutal global wars, and the fact that the gap between rich and poor continued to widen, the 20th century must also be recognized as a brief period of extraordinary achievement for our species. Nevertheless, for the planet as a whole, human achievements represented something very different. A grab by a single species for control of the resources of Earth at the expense of all other species. In the 20th century, humans began to transform the biosphere itself, raising profound questions about the very meaning of growth if it threatens the ecological foundations upon which modern societies depend. We have transformed the Earth's soils through farming, mining, and road and dam building on a massive scale. Our impact has been more powerful, more transformative than all the natural forces of erosion, glaciation, and mountain building combined. Our use of water increased ninefold in the 20th century as we began to use up the stores of it contained in aquifers, like the vast Ogallala Aquifer in the United States that stretches from the Dakotas to Texas. All manner of statistics show that as humans pave land over for roads and cities, chop down forests, or plow land for farming, we destroy the habitats of other species. Current rates of extinction are about 1,000 times more rapid than they have been for most of Earth's recent history. But perhaps the biggest danger of all is our transformation of the chemical makeup of the atmosphere itself, leading to the potential for unstoppable global warming and all of its devastating impacts. A sharp increase in the levels of greenhouse gases, mostly carbon dioxide and methane, in the atmosphere has trapped more of the heat from solar radiation, raising global temperatures to the warmest ever recorded. During the era of agrarian civilizations, carbon dioxide was about 200 parts per million of atmospheric gases. Today it is about 550 parts per million. The power of our species to radically transform our environment seems to be increasing much faster than our understanding of the implications of these transformations. And we cannot help but wonder whether the result will be another terrible collapse in population, similar to the kind that Thomas Malthus had predicted. We previously introduced the notion of the Anthropocene, a term coined by Nobel Prize-winning climatologist Paul Crutzen in 1995. The Anthropocene, he argued, is an entirely new epoch in the history of Earth, an epoch in which, for the first time in the history of Earth, one single species has come to utterly dominate the biosphere. There is no denying the fact that the appearance of our species marks a fundamental turning point in the history of our planet, and this fact has become even clearer in recent decades. Even as recently as the 1990s, awareness of the potential for environmental catastrophe was minimal. Yet today, most educated humans know that global collaboration is necessary to avert it. The question is, will we have the wisdom to do so while there is still time to change our future?